Hello and welcome to this SOA at Home festival event on publishing contracts and how to improve them. You join us as we mark the beginning of the 9th and final week of our autumn-winter festival season, which concludes on Thursday. More on that later. I'm Theo Jones and I'm one of the contracts advisors at the SOA, a role I have held for just coming up to 4 years now. I previously worked in publishing, and the majority of that experience was as a rights and licensing manager selling subsidiary rights. Subsidiary rights are essentially those rights taken by a publisher from an author with a view to their onward sale. So, for example, translation, film and television rights. Of course, you'll have noticed that I'm not alone on your screens today, and it gives me quite considerable pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague and co-host for today's event, Catherine Fuller. Catherine is also a contracts advisor, far more experienced one than I, and as Secretary to the Translators Association has a particular interest in translation agreements and queries. In a previous life, Catherine was the administrator for the British Centre for Literary Translation. So in just a few minutes, I will be handing over to Catherine to start the event proper. We'll aim to talk for around 35 minutes, after which we'll be hoping to address some of your questions. Do feel free to add these into the chat box as we go through. Now, we're not expecting any technical difficulties today, but if we do become unresponsive on your screens without good reason, do try hitting the reconnect button, which you should see at the top of your screens. And just one final word from me for now, and this is going to sound all very familiar for our festival regulars who join us today. This session, in common with most of our festival events, is free for members, but if you can afford to, please consider donating to our Authors Contingency Fund, and we suggest a minimum donation of £5. The fund is to support authors in financial difficulty due to the health crisis, and the link will be posted into the chat for you. That all said, Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Theo. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. So, publishing contracts and how to improve them. What do we do when we look at your contract? A simple question, you might think, but a surprisingly complex answer, one which I hope I'll be able to shed some light on for you this afternoon and help you to get the most out of the process. One of the many good things about SOA membership is our free, unlimited professional advice. Every year, our advisory team review thousands of contracts sent in by SOA members for confidential and clause-by-clause contract vetting. But what does this mean in practice? And how can you get maximum benefit from the commentaries which we provide? We want you to feel comfortable and empowered in taking these forward with your publisher and to see maximum return from your negotiation. As we go through, we'll be referring to some of our guides, and you'll find links to these in the chat. We'll also be including a blog based on the talk in the SOA December newsletter. So, your contract has arrived in our info@societyofauthors.org inbox. And what happens next? To start with, there are simple things which you can do to help us to help you. Please make sure you send in your query only once. This helps us treat all members fairly and avoids us inadvertently vetting the same contract twice. All contracts and queries are logged. We aim to respond within 5 to 10 working days, although we always try to do so more quickly, depending on the volume of queries. If you haven't heard from us after a week, then please do get in touch in case it has got mislaid. This timing also allows queries to be looked at by several advisors if necessary, and to research and include any relevant paperwork. Don't feel pressured to sign your contract before you are ready. We are your professional union, and no reputable publisher should ever object to your taking the time to have your agreement thoroughly vetted. Please give us as much background information as possible. It might be your very first contract. Congratulations, or your 5th book in a series. It's really helpful to know how much you've already discussed with the publisher and if you've agreed any changes. Each contract is an individual negotiation, and different things are important to different people. For example, perhaps it's a low advance, but you may have negotiated a better royalty in compensation. Context is all important. So your contract has reached an advisor, but who are the advisory team and who are we not? We're a team of in-house advisors, highly experienced in UK publishing, and we've been helping authors for many years. Each advisor has their own special interest, so we also bring our experience to areas such as translation, script writing, or graphic novels. Please note, however, that we are not lawyers and we're not insured to give definitive legal advice. However, if we can't help or we think further advice is needed, then we will always be very happy to signpost additional legal and professional support and resources. The first thing we do when you look at your contract is, not surprisingly perhaps, see what's in it. Our priority is to explain the terms in your contract as clearly as possible and their practical implications for you and for your work. We go through your contract clause by clause, assessing it for fairness, demystifying the terminology, and breaking down complex issues. We'll often refer to one of our guides, such as the publishing contracts or the translator-publisher contract and commentary, which list the key terms which we would expect to see. All these guides are free to SOA members, but it's important to remember that they are not just a checklist, but they're a tool to help you, so they shouldn't be looked at in isolation. We also look for what isn't in your contract. A short contract with a lot left out can be just as problematic as a longer one with lots of detail. If something is important to you, then make sure it is included in writing. As much of our work is taken up in dealing with the problems in existing contracts as it is with looking at new ones. Never assume it will all be all right and you can sort it out later. We have filing cabinets of members' files to prove the point. Omissions can be straightforward, a commitment to send proofs or a lack of detail about how and when you will be paid. Or more seriously, termination and warranty clauses can be omitted. If something is important to you, whatever it is, make sure it is clear and in writing. As we read through the contract, we focus on the range of rights you are granting and the income that you can expect to receive in return. Broadly speaking, the terms that we look at fall into three areas: clarifiers, softeners, and sweeteners. And on that cliffhanger, I'm going to hand over to Theo, who is going to explore these in more detail. Theo.
Thank you, Catherine. So clarifiers are the terms that make the contract more transparent and easier to understand. A bad clause is, of course, not just about bad or poor terms. Vagueness and ambiguity can be a problem too, and often cause difficulties at a later stage. A clause may be enforced in ways that don't reflect intentions, or it may be unenforceable at law, meaning that it cannot be relied upon. Now, the importance of clarity is reflected in our long-standing creator campaign for fairer and more transparent contracts. The C from the acronym stands for clearer contracts, including written contracts which set out the exact scope of the rights granted. So now let's work through some examples. Number one. Now, usually somewhere near the top of a contract, you will find a grant of rights. Copyright laws prevent anyone from using your work without your consent, and a so-called grant of rights clause sets out what the contracting publisher or producer has your permission to do. Now, in an ideal world, and you see this most often in film agreements, it will be accompanied by a sentence or two that cover the rights that are reserved, i.e. what the publisher can't do with your work. Now, realistically, you don't see that in publishing contracts. What that means, however, is that you do want it to be as clear as you can be what exactly the rights are that you are granting. You may be surprised to learn, for example, that we still see reference to volume form, despite it still not being at all clear whether this refers only to the print edition or extends to include an ebook version. If it extends to include an ebook version, does it extend to include any enhanced version or indeed any other digital edition beyond a verbatim reproduction of the print text? The fact that it is arguable, and this is the key point, means that for those writers who are intending to grant only print rights, should be careful to ensure the grant is worded appropriately, i.e. print volume form. So moving on to our second example in this category of clarifiers, it remains the case for authors receiving advance payments that the total amount will be likely paid out in instalments. A share will be paid once the contract has been signed, and a share will be paid on delivery of the work to the publisher. Very often, that second advance will be payable on delivery and acceptance of the work. Now, without a corresponding clause that allows for a specified period for the publisher to review and accept the work, which you don't often see, the publisher will potentially be able to delay making this payment to you after delivery on the basis that they are yet to accept the work. Far better would be a clause that clarified that the second payment would be made on delivery of an acceptable manuscript. We would also like to see it clarified that an acceptable manuscript will be one that meets the specifications agreed at the time the work was contracted and a standard of professional competency, perhaps. It is, I think, also just worth mentioning that sometimes an advance instalment will be payable on publication. I will turn to look at a publisher's commitment to publish under the contract shortly, but if you are offered a publication advance, we would in addition hope that this payment would be made on publication or no later than X, just to cover you in the event that publication is delayed. Now, it is often unclear from the grant of rights wording, and this is moving on to the third example that we discussed above, i.e. where a publisher takes your permission to publish your work in print volume form, for example, the extent to which, if any, the publisher will be able to edit or amend your original work or your original text. You may want to ensure additional wording is introduced into the contract, if not in there already, to clarify the position. For example, it could be clarified that whilst the publisher will be permitted to copy edit the work within all the usual industry parameters, any more material changes should be subject to the consent of the author. And moving on to the fourth example, and then we come to publication. Or if we revisit that creator acronym we mentioned earlier, E for exploitation, that is exploitation of the rights granted. It is very common that a publisher will commit to publish your work. If the publisher agrees to publish X months from delivery and acceptance, then you're coming across the same issues that I mentioned previously. There could be delays unless the publisher agrees to accept the work within a specified period. A publisher should really agree to publish within X months from delivery of the acceptable manuscript. Ideally, you would also have a form specified here. For example, the publisher will publish the work in print volume, electronic, and audiobook format within X months. However, speaking realistically, this remains relatively rare. You are, however, advised to ask the publisher to give you a clear indication prior to entering into a contract as to how that publisher intends to publish, that is, in what forms and on what schedule. And just one final example under this category of clarifiers. A publishing contract will almost always include a clause that lays out the circumstances under which you will be able to get your rights back. You would be surprised by how many contracts still refer to this right arising where a work is out of print, without any further definition of what that means. You will almost certainly need further clarification that a work will be considered out of print where the publisher's stock has diminished significantly and they have no interest in arranging a reprint. Otherwise, a publisher may, probably with some justification, argue that a work remains in print even where they are no longer reprinting the work, but simply have it available on a print to order or a so-called print-on-demand basis. If challenged on this, a publisher may well be more amenable to agreeing a sales threshold, so that if the work is only available on a POD, print-on-demand, or ebook basis, i.e. if the publisher is not holding hard copy stock, then the author will have a right to request a reversion if sales dip below that threshold and the publisher fails to revive those sales on notice. Our view, quite simply, is that print-on-demand publishing is still a very different beast to traditional publishing, and so that for contracts that are entered into on that basis, i.e. on the basis that a publisher will be committing to a print run and holding stock in their warehouse, any print-on-demand publishing should need the approval of the author, and the work would not be considered in print for the purpose of an out-of-print reversion right. And now we're going to move on to our second category, which was the so-called sweeteners. Now, sweeteners are generally incentives and they can provide motivation, but they also help to ensure that the parties' interests remain aligned over the life of the contract. Sweeteners can also be used to recognize and reward success. So if we look once again at the creator acronym, we find that the first R stands for remuneration, as we call for equitable and unwaivable remuneration for each use or exploitation of an author's work. So this would include a bestseller clause, so that if a work does far better than expected, the creator shares in its success, even if copyright was assigned. So for us then, there is quite considerable overlap between what we might refer to as a sweetener here and what might be negotiated as a material key term to the deal. That is the payments that you are going to receive for the work that you complete and the rights that you're granting. So if we just work through some examples, and I thought I would start by just looking again at that basic principle of the royalty model, which is a feature of most contracts that we see, and rightly so. Because what a royalty does is to ensure that your remuneration or the payments that you'll receive is tied to the commercial value of the publisher's project. For a lot of you, that will essentially be your book as packaged and readied for sale by the publisher. For others, that might be the publisher's translation of your book or a producer's adaptation of your work for film. Publishers will generally be paying a royalty on copies sold, calculated on their net receipts on sales. So that would be the price that the book sells for, less any agreed discount retained by the retailer and or the distributor, as well as any other deductions such as VAT. Now, if a publisher is not able to agree to offer a royalty on each copy sold, then we would expect them to do so after sales exceed a certain level, or perhaps less common, the publisher's income exceeds a certain level for that project. A publisher will have costs associated with the printing and the sale of the book, but they will also have costs associated with the bringing of the work through production and to market, and those are so-called startup costs. At the very least, I would argue the royalty payment should kick in once those startup costs have earned out. So we would hope to see a higher royalty or an additional advance paid out once sales increase, or indeed additional fees, and especially where sales have exceeded expectations, then that could be tied to sales alone, so the number of copies sold, or sales across a certain period. It is perhaps less ideal, but it is also possible to agree that additional payments will be negotiated in good faith down the line. Just to add as an addendum here, we do continue to lobby for the headline provisions of the EU Copyright Directive to be enshrined into domestic UK law, even though there is no obligation now on the UK government to do so. That would help to ensure that authors have a right at law to benefit proportionately from the commercial success of their work. As to how this would work in practice remains unclear, and will likely remain unclear really until tested in the courts. At the minimum, however, we would hope that it might redress the imbalance of power so often seen in the context of creator, publisher, producer negotiations. A second example within this category of sweeteners might be the number of copies that a publisher might be willing to give you on publication or sell to you at a discount, and whether perhaps they would be open for you to sell those copies on, for example, at a local event. If you are going to want to purchase stock from the publisher, it is absolutely worth your while negotiating a discount or gratis copy allowance as part of the wider contract negotiation rather than down the line. A third example here. A publisher may ask that you do not publish any other work that might affect the sales or indeed their enjoyment of the rights granted under the contract. These types of so-called non-compete provisions can be onerous and long-standing, And in many cases, we would have concerns. The publisher's commercial interests should be sufficiently protected by the fact that you're granting rights on an exclusive basis. That means that you can't take that project to another publisher. However, the publisher may be willing to curtail the time length so that this runs only for a limited period from publication and apply to only certain specific works. For some authors, for example, non-fiction authors, this will be seen as less of a sweetener and more of a key term in the negotiation. A fourth example here, insofar as they can induce you to enter into an arrangement, I might also add that approvals and consents can be seen in the category of sweeteners. You might be convinced of the publisher's editorial and production expertise, but just need the confidence that the publisher won't proceed, for example, with a particular cover design without your consent. You might also be happy for the publisher to handle subsidiary rights or secondary rights, but would like to know again that you'll be notified or have a right to at least comment on that process. And now we come to our third and final category, last but not least, the softeners. Softeners can give additional nuance to contracts beyond the options of what both parties can or cannot do. They can be a useful negotiating tool, and common terms, the sorts of wording that you're going to be looking out for here include good faith, best endeavours, and reasonable. So I suggested above that under certain circumstances, a right of approval might be offered as a sweetener, usually where a publisher is already committed to work with you in good faith. Even so, it is possible that a publisher will want that grant of approval to be softened, so that whilst you will have a right to approve a book's jacket design, for example, that approval will be construed in the contract as being not to be unreasonably withheld, conditioned, or delayed. A second example here is that of the option clause. If a publisher is paying a healthy advance, promising high production values, and committing to clear and convincing marketing strategy for your book, you might be willing to give them an option over your next work. What you don't want to do is to agree that this next work is contracted on the same terms and conditions of the current contract. Instead, you will be able to negotiate those terms in good faith. So I also touched above on the so-called non-compete clause, which is designed to prevent a contracted writer from working with another publisher on competing projects. Very often, this clause will be worded such that the restriction will apply to any work that may be in the publisher's absolute discretion to be competing. And this is problematic. If an author is in discussions with another publisher on a project, there's no way that they're going to know for sure that they're not falling foul of this clause without presenting details of the new project to the original publisher, something that is likely to fill the new publisher with dread. We're quite firmly, therefore, of the view that the test should be an objective one. It should apply where there is an actual possibility of competition in the market. And we also suggest that this applies only to projects that are substantially similar across content, form, and style, and that it is time limited. The consent required from the original publisher should also be such that shall not be unreasonably withheld, delayed, or conditioned. Another clause, and this brings me to the final example, and this is a key part of any publishing contract, which we haven't really yet looked at here, is the warranty provision, where an author is asked to confirm, amongst other things, that their work is not unlawful. We like to see this type of promise conditioned or qualified so that it only applies to the best of the author's knowledge and belief. And so as we read your contract, we will be thinking about where you will be able to clarify the language or give yourself more room for maneuver. And in short, we will be aiming to clarify the language, soften the impact, and sweeten the deal. More broadly, we would encourage you to think about trade-offs. We encourage you to think about what terms are the most important to you, and based on our collective experience of industry practice and parameters, draw a distinction between those amendments that might be realistic and those that are more ideal. We will also, of course, advise on red flags. So it follows then that we'll very rarely tell you exactly what to do. We'll explain, suggest, recommend, and point out the implications of doing or not doing certain things. But we do want to empower you to take control of your work, to understand the rights that you're granting, and also what you can expect in return. And just remember that you should never be afraid to ask to be fairly paid, or to query a poor term, or feel forced to sign anything that you don't understand. And that brings me to the end of my piece on the clarifiers, softeners, and sweeteners. And if we can at this stage take some questions from you guys. I did have a couple that were sent in advance, so I'll just start with those. Let me just bring those up now. Okay, Catherine, are you ready?
I haven't seen these, I should say, so.
No, of course, no, and I have. So, question number 1. If you try to negotiate too strongly with the publisher, is there a risk that they walk away? And this is a question that I recognize we get asked this with relative frequency. Now, in my view, the whole, it's, I mean, yes, there is a risk, but in my view, a publisher should never decide to walk away from the deal for the fact that you have either tried to negotiate or asked for something that they don't want to give you. Their response to your request should be to say that's not something that we can work with, or that won't make it, you know, that's not a clause that we can agree to. And then that will come back to you to decide whether or not to proceed with the deal. So it should never be the case that a publisher should decline to take the project forward or abandon a project on the basis that you've raised these issues with them. I mean, my view is that they should respect your professionalism and understanding, and your awareness that you too are a business, as they are, as the publisher, and negotiate with a sort of a fairness and a reasonable a sense of duty. I would say. I don't know if you would agree with that, Catherine.
Yes, I would, and I think in instances where publishers have walked away, it's normally, to be honest, it's been in your best interest that they have. If they're going to pull the plug very quickly over something like that, it very often means that there's something, you know, a really wrong with it anyway. I mean, my background is in translation, and I can certainly think of a couple of instances with translation contracts where, particularly with translators starting out, they have pushed back with the publisher, you know, very politely, just on quite, you know, basic details sometimes around payment, for example. And often what happens is it shines a light on what may be wrong with the rest of the deal. And when a publisher does walk away, certainly in the context of translations, it always seems to be that in fact the funding wasn't there and the project wasn't viable, and you're well out of it. And it's as we were saying before, you know, the SOA is your trade union, and you should never be afraid to consult us. You know, if a publisher starts to get rather nervous about the fact that you're talking to us, then it's the publisher that's got the problem. So as Theo says, I think if you're polite and you document everything, and I think asking for information is really good as well. You know, this is a point I would make. Transparency is all important. It's really important, particularly for something like royalties, to have an idea, for example, of what the print run's likely to be, or where they expect the most sales. You know, asking for that information, you know, trying to find out as much as you possibly can about the whole project can really help you. And in most cases, I think, publishers will respond to that. And if they won't, then they'll tell you. But they shouldn't, simply pull the plug. I would really encourage people to ask.
Yeah, but it's also worth adding there that you do have a right to union representation, which is so you have a right at law to seek out advice and be advised by us. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you mention to the publisher that this is what the SOA has told you, and they have then abandoned the deal, they are actually they're taking quite a risky approach there, because they can't deal with you. They can't discriminate you essentially on the grounds that you're a member of our union and are acting upon our advice. So do bear that in mind too. Secondly, I have heard that a key advantage of signing with a big agency is that they have a better template contracts with publishers, largely based on previous negotiations. Is that usually the case? And my response to that would be, whilst we are aware that agencies will have their own boilerplates that they've crafted throughout the years with publishers, and yes, of course, that can work to the benefit of the author, and the author should see that as a key value add that the agency will bringing to their, that partnership, that representation of your interests. But I would also say that, the majority of agents will be working in your best interest. They will be negotiating hard on your behalf, and actually not having a boilerplate might encourage, doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing with an agent. And it might encourage them to revisit or visit areas that perhaps have been, accepted across the years. I don't think it's I think it's a value add that could work, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. I don't know if you've heard of that, Catherine.
No, I mean, all I would say is that all boilerplates, they don't start off as boilerplates. They all start from somewhere. They're all basically based on practice in the industry, so you always have to start somewhere. So I think even in that kind of circumstance, it's actually not necessarily a bad thing. And I think for agents and for publishers, to think about their practice, I think that can be, genuinely helpful. And I certainly know where agents are very happy to do that. And I think that's important. Anybody who's really serious in the business is open to things, and being able to think differently about how we do things and how we can do them to the advantage of both parties. It's a very flexible, it's a very fluid world now. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. The other thing I would say is basically a sales pitch. Do remember that we do have a very good guide on working with an agent. So if you're an SOA member, that's available for free on the SOA website, and for a small fee, it can be purchased by non-members.
And do you think, this is another question, do you think the author is empowered or entitled to suggest their own amendments, issues with the contract in addition to their agent, or does everything always go through the agent when negotiating with publishers?
I'm pushing that one back to you, Theo.
Well, I think an agent, anyone that has entered into an agency contract will know that the agent will almost certainly want to be able to represent you, well, most usually your entire literary output on an exclusive basis. Occasionally you'll see an agent just handle one title or one set of rights, but it is very unusual still. And as part of that, or kind of ancillary to that, is the fact that an agent will want to have kind of control or ownership over those deals. So I think it's very, very, you should feel very encouraged to send through any contracts that are presented to you that have been negotiated by your agents through the SOA. We get asked that a lot, whether we look at agent negotiated agreements, and we absolutely do. And some authors might just want a second set of eyes. Some authors might want to benefit from the sort of wealth of experience that we have. We advise thousands of contracts every year, so we've got that breadth of experience. They might want us to comment on how the provisions tie into our own campaign work, etc., and flag the kind of issues that are likely to be to be important. But I would say any kind of and when we go back to the author with our comments in that scenario, the author is entitled either to take those back to the agent and say, well, this is what the SOA have advised me, or they can simply say, well, this is, these are a couple of comments not mentioned that they've come from us. And go back to the agent, and the agent will discuss those through with you. I mean, they're under duty at law to act in your best interests, so they shouldn't be saying, don't come to me with any comments or concerns. So they should negotiate those they should discuss those with you, and then take those forwards for negotiation with the publisher. So what I would say, so if you do have comments or concerns, either that come through us or from your own side, raise them with the agent. And if you want to discuss those directly, just make sure the agent's aware. Otherwise, just let the agent handle those and take those forward with the publisher. So that's quite a convoluted response. Let me just bring up our fourth and final advanced question, and then we'll take some from the chat. Yes, okay. It feels to me, I think this is one from one of your members, Catherine, your translators. It feels to me as though translation contracts are getting steadily better across the years. But I'm curious to know whether you feel that's true generally across the board for author contracts. Well, every time I end the week thinking things are looking better, and actually I've seen some really good contract negotiations with the big industry players, but also with maybe smaller players that are amending their contracts, kind of, in light of the fact that they might only be doing print on demand publishing. They're agreeing that actually, in light of that, they should be agreeing a fixed term period rather than a life of copyright grant. Whenever you kind of end the week with having had a series of those, you feel really, really positive. But you have to be ready to then open your inbox on a Monday and find that something still utterly unfair and unthinkable has been agreed or tried to be presented or offered to the publisher. And it it probably lends us credibility in our roles as contracts advisors, and, reassures us, why we do what we do. And it also lends weight to, the lobbying work that we do that I referenced earlier. We desperately need those copyright directive provisions, the obligation to be transparent, the obligation to fairly remunerate the author, and the obligation to return rights and not sit on rights that a publisher or producer isn't making use of. So I would say there is a trend, and things are getting steadily better. Just on the question of those players that are using print on demand to set up their own initiatives, obviously that allows you to access a marketplace that would generally only have been available to people with the resource to print stock and rent warehousing and things like that. I mentioned the life of copyright. A lot of the agreements that we saw in the early days of print on demand were for the life of copyright, with the same termination clauses that a publisher would have agreed if they were arranging a hard copy print run. So increasingly we're seeing those players and those organizations agree to sort of 10 to 15 years, which is where we would like to see kind of fixed term contracts anyway. So yeah, in that sense, that's an area where things are definitely getting better. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Catherine.
Yes, I mean, my instinct is to say that that translators are always the trailblazers, so they always lead the way. And I think, one thing I think translators have always had to fight their corner, and I think perhaps they were early adopters, if you like, in trying to understand more about the whole process, understanding what their contracts meant, because they were often the only people who'd ever seen a book before the publisher agreed to commission it. They're used to fighting for their books. And I think translators became what Sarah Ardizoni, if I may quote her, called the 360-degree translator. And I think translators started to educate themselves about the publishing business and started to understand more about their publishers, more about the problems that their editors, for example, were facing. And then that also worked the other way round. So I think that mutual education and understanding has really borne dividends over the last, well, certainly the last 5 years that I've been in the SOA, and the last 20 that I've been involved in translation. I mean, it's interesting now, I see a far less assignment of rights than I used to when I started, to the extent it's now quite unusual, particularly in a UK contract. It's very unusual in my experience to see a full assignment of rights. I mean, the grant of rights, it might be terrible, but it is still, you know, ensuring that the translator has copyright. And interestingly, in lots of examples, when you do push back, people are very happy to change things. You know, publishers, particularly in something like translation, if they're not used to it, they simply grab a boilerplate contract from somewhere, you know, change the word author to translator and assume that that will fit. And it's only when you start to go through it with them that they realise that, of course, that it doesn't. And I think those wider issues apply across publishing as well. You know, there's an awful lot of new publishers out there, and they're learning too. And I think that's something which we realise, that a lot of smaller publishers in particular are very keen to get it right, and they might not be able to deliver absolutely everything, but they know what they're aiming towards and they're very clear. I think that's important as well. Clarity is that everybody understands. As I've said before, you know, don't sign a contract that you don't understand. You should never feel pressurized into doing that. So I think generally across the board, dialogue is better and people are understanding each other better. I don't think that answers your question, but
no. Very helpful. So this is coming to the chat now. Emily Kenny has asked, would you expect agented authors to have had terms improved and considered by their agents? Yes, you would. Again, that's a key part of the value package that an agency is bringing to the table. Not only are they taking care of all the administrative work on your behalf, but they should be seeking out opportunities, and once opportunities are found, maximizing the commercial return, but also the terms more generally in your favor. So, you know, I mentioned bestseller clauses, I mentioned sales threshold in the context of reversion right. Those are all kind of clauses and provisions that agents will be asking for day after day after day, regardless of whether they've got boilerplate agreements in place with the publishers. So yes, there should be some element of negotiation that takes place. And Pauline, how do I know whether a publisher... Sorry, did you have anything to add, Catherine, on that?
No, I was just going to say that don't forget that many agents strongly encourage their authors to join us. I think that's a point that's worth bearing in mind. And we are, of course, members of the AAA through our own estates. Yeah.
Pauline's question, how do I know whether a publisher gives me first or secondary rights, please? So the primary rights are generally the rights that a publisher would take from an author that they're anticipating making use of with some sort of immediacy. So they'll be thinking, I'm going to publish a print volume book, I'm going to publish an ebook version, and for all intents and purposes, those are the primary rights. Secondary rights are the rights to adapt the work into film, into an audiobook edition, into an audiobook edition is interesting actually, because an audio is increasingly seen as a primary right, because that's a right that should only really be granted to a publisher where the publisher is actually going to make use of it. It should no longer be a right that the publisher takes and then sells on, which is what they do with the majority of the secondary rights. In that set of secondary rights, you also have, and this is something that is important to be aware of, a reprint right. So this would allow the publisher to sell to allow another publisher to reprint a print edition of the book. And this was used historically in the case of hardback, paperback, when there was more of a distinction between those two products in the market. So a hardback publisher would generally see a paperback right as being a secondary right and work with partners such as Penguin, who have excellent global distribution in the paperback market, on a paperback edition. These days, paperback reprint rights or hardback reprint rights are one of those categories of rights that we definitely think that authors should be able to consent to before a publisher can actually sell those rights to another publisher or any other third party, basically. Yeah, so and one other thing to say about secondary rights is that it can be appropriate to allow the publisher to make use of them or try and sell them within a certain period of time. So you might give them a few years or 5 or 10 years from publication of their edition to actually market the book, to take it around to all their established networks, to take it to the international book fairs, the Frankfurt Book Fair, the London Book Fair, to see whether anyone's interested in those rights. And if they're not interested, or if they're not able to secure a deal, then they give those rights back to the author. Sarah has asked, do you have any tips for entering negotiations with a publisher if you don't have an agent? What do you think, Catherine? This comes back to a lot of what you were saying about feeling empowered, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I think do your homework is what I would say. I mean, if you're looking at, it depends what stage we're talking about. If you're approaching a publisher who will accept a book directly rather than through an agent, I think one of the things, to be honest, is to look at what kind of deal am I getting? And I think that's maybe quite important at an early stage. Is it a deal where you're being paid in advance, however small, or is it hidden somewhere in the small print, somewhere where you will be expected to contribute to publication? And that latter point, it may seem obvious, but it might not be clear to begin with. And I think it's really important to be aware of that and to think about what's important to you. Different things are important to different people. For some people, the prime consideration may well be simply to get the book out there. It may be to get access to it to a particular market. For somebody else, the purely financial aspect of it may be important. To someone else, it may be a question of professional reputation, of having your name out there on a book. It may be something that you need for professional purposes. So I think, being aware of all those things before you start, of knowing what's important to you, I think that really helps. And I think as well, simply being as aware of possible about the industry. I can't stress this enough. It's really important to do your research. Don't just sort of, stick a pin in and find a publisher. All that research really does pay dividends. And certainly in something like translations, which is my speciality, it's really, really important to do that and to approach your publisher aimed with information about sales in other countries, about whether the authors speaks really good English and is available for publicity, where you think it sits on their list, all that kind of thing. And do ask publishers a lot as well. I mean, Theo was saying about audiobooks. It's really important to try and find out, what rights publishers expect to exploit. So I think you need to always keep a paper trail of everything. Always be polite, always be clear, follow things up. And I think and there will always come a point at which, you will need to make the call. As we were saying earlier, we very rarely tell you exactly what to do, but we want to empower you to think, well, if I do X, then Y will happen. So I think simply if you are in negotiation with a publisher, that's an important first step. Have confidence in your work. You want to get the book out there, and your publisher wants to sell books. So I think that's something that's always important to hold on to.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I would just add that I think if you are able to identify in the contract or the offer terms that have been presented to you where you think you might go back and ask for more information, as you were saying, Catherine, that's quite an easy step to make. I'm really interested in this offer, but I would like to know more about this. And I think historically publishers haven't been that great at actually selling themselves and what they do, and identify the terms that need to be clarified, the softeners and the sweeteners, because that reassures you that you're not asking for, in many circumstances, you're not asking for major changes to the deal. You're potentially doing that as well if you're asking for a lot more as an advance payment, or a lot higher fee. For example, your translators per 1,000 word, those fees. But if you're identifying, this is just a question of clarification, this is positive for all parties, because it basically helps to clarify what the position is and what the understanding is. The softeners, it's something that the publisher is already probably reassuring you, will be the case or will happen. It's just a question of getting it written into the contract. And the sweeteners, it's, the principle is that you should benefit where the project is successful. And also, there should be some little motivation, and the publisher should very well be able to just come back to you and say, look, I'm sorry, on this occasion, that's not something that we can agree to. And then if you choose to, and we will give, from our side, we'll give you an indication of what's realistic. We'll give you an indication of what's ideal, and we can speak to you and help you to kind of whittle down our clause by clause contract vetting so that you can understand, you can sort of repackage that into something that you're comfortable taking forward with the publisher or the producer. Yes. Do agents negotiate your publishing contract too? Do you need to show it to the society and your agent? So we sort of touched on this before. Yes, agents should absolutely be negotiating your arrangements on your behalf. They won't take the authority to actually close those deals for you. They'll have to come back to you and explain through the contract before they then ask you to sign it. And do you need to show it to the society and your agents? You don't need to show it to us, but you're very welcome to do so, if only for an extra pair of eyes, or if there's something that you might feel you don't quite understand, but you've asked the agent, they haven't explained it, and you still don't. You just need it to be explained in another way, from another perspective. Just speak to us, and we can look at those for you. James, what about contracts with agents? What are the worst abuses, things to watch for with those? What do you think, Catherine?
Well, that's a whole other session, isn't it?
Worst abuses. Yes, exactly.
Worst abuses. Yes.
Yeah. Generally speaking, there is a trade association for authors' agents, the Association of Authors' Agents, and it remains the case that if an agent isn't a member of that organization, they are showing some adherence to the code of practice that organization has available to their members, and they ask their members to sign up to say that they're going to abide by the code. But yeah, so an agent should always be acting on the best interests of their clients. There are other duties at law that prevent them from making a secret profit, but those aren't generally concerns that we ever come across. Where we do find issues, I suppose it might be where an agent or an author doesn't feel that their interests are being represented, and they're going to their agent and saying, well, actually, this isn't something I'd like to do. Or more generally, the agent isn't doing enough, or isn't kind of doing enough for the agent, for the author. They're not accounting properly. There are duties with respect to accounting, so the agent should be reporting back to the author and saying, look, this is the work that I've done on your behalf. And very often an author will feel that they're not sort of regular enough. so to speak. But an agent should be able to say, look, I'm going to the Frankfurt Book Fair in a couple of months. I've got some publishers that I'm going to pitch this to, and I'll let you know how I get on after the fair. See how it goes. What do you think, Catherine?
Yeah, I think accounting's probably one of the most common issues, isn't it? And we sometimes see issues with agents who are perhaps on the verge of retirement or have retired, and sometimes authors feel that they're not getting what they should out of their agent, and that can cause frustrations. I think that's perhaps another area where we do see issues.
And all agents will take commission arising under a contract that they negotiate for the life of that contract. So if that contract runs on after, which is most likely to be the case, after, if you part ways with your agent, that publishing contract is more than likely going to extend on, until that edition comes off the market, or, and they'll be taking their commission. So you've moved on to another agent. That original agent that signed a deal will have a right to their commission. But what it doesn't necessarily follow is that they will be servicing that agreement on your behalf. So they should still be, any kind of renewal of that contract should be handled by your new agent. But they should still be kind of chasing up paperwork, making sure that you get paid on time, and all this kind of stuff. So they should be continuing to service that agreement even if they're no longer your agents. And that can be an issue, can't it? They can just sit back and let the royalties
come in,
stack up without doing any work. Foreign rights. Michael, should publishers be informing, consulting me on foreign publication, Kindle, etc.? So if you have signed a contract, very often what we'll say is we'd need to see the paperwork to see whether there's any kind of right of approval that's written into the agreement. Otherwise, we'll try and see if there's any kind of representations that they made to you before you entered into the contract to say that they would be coming back to you for your consent or approval on third-party sales. If not, if under contract the publisher has taken a right not only to negotiate third-party deals, but also to agree to them on your behalf and sell those rights on your behalf, then there's little you can do. Of course, they should be accounting to you properly. Whether or not they'll agree to let you see a copy of the contract that they've signed is slightly unclear. Many probably won't, regrettably. But yes, they should be reassuring you, and they should be updating you, and they should be giving the opportunity to ask whether you to ask for copies of any sub-licensed editions. And importantly, they should be knowing, they should be telling you how long the term of the license and all that kind of thing. But yeah, if you're pre-contract, you need to get it written in as either a key term of the negotiation, say, look, I absolutely want a right of approval, or you just ask them, will I be consulted? They'll say yes, and you'll say, well, I would like that written in as a sort of either a clarifier or a sweetener into the deal. As a contractual.
That's a classic example of where something that isn't in the contract can be as important as something that is in the contract. And particularly if you think that a book, has potential in a foreign market, that's something to be very much aware of.
Yeah.
We're nearly up, I think, aren't we, for time?
We are nearly up. One general question. And this would be a neat place to finish, I think. Can the Society of Authors help me to create an agreement with my co-author, or advise me where to get help with this? Do just contact us, follow up with us. And this goes for anyone that has any questions that we've been unable to get to today. I have tried to work through in the order that they were put to us. And we can follow up with you directly. As Catherine mentioned at the head of the session, you are very welcome to come to us for unlimited advice, any members, and we will, where research is needed, we'll just research the issues and get back to you with a proper response. Including when it comes to joint authorship and co-author deals, which we're increasingly actually seeing a lot of, and particularly in my area, which is script writing. I do a lot of work with the script writers group. So yes, I don't know if you had any final words, Catherine, to add on that in terms of your.
other than thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you for tuning in. Yeah, so that does conclude our time with you all today. And it just remains for me to thank Sophia, our festival director, my colleague Nadia, who has been moderating for us behind the scenes for us today, my co-host Catherine, for your knowledge and your eloquence, of course, and also to you all for coming. Now, you can catch Nadia on Thursday as she chats with Dean Atta in the last of our afternoon tea sessions, and indeed the closing event of the festival, which will be returning in the spring. Head to our website, societyofauthors.org/events. The link should be appearing in the chat. Alternatively, head over to our festival tent on Vimeo to catch up on any events that you may have missed, or indeed to find events that you enjoyed so much, including this one, that you would like to listen again. Recordings are available at vimeo.com/the Society of Authors. Again, check the chat for the link. If you are on Twitter, do carry the conversation forward. Our festival hashtag is #SOA at home. And that's it. Thank you all so much for coming. I've been Theo Jones. Catherine, you've been?
I've been Catherine Fuller.
It's goodbye for now. Thank you.
Bye.